Here it is. 193.
193.
So says the holy Ramchal. In previous sections, we've discussed how all created things originate in the transcendental forces, which essentially means that if you go all the way up, you see the roots of what's happening down here. Nothing happens down here like for naught. And nothing happens down here as the origin of the story. Everything originates in the higher worlds. These forces are arranged in a logical system with various divisions from which the different categories of physical phenomena are derived. Which means once you go up there, you see a very organized system. A lot of the work of Kabbalah is to take you up to those worlds and to introduce you to the mechanics of how energy comes from the higher worlds to the lower worlds. The system of how it works. That if you can tap into that sequence, you could bring great blessing to the world. We have likewise discussed the evil forces from which all the evils in the physical world originate. And therefore, evil down here is not just an isolated thing, it's having its roots in higher forces. And therefore, someone is not doing good things, there may well be that they're really connecting, and to the degree that they're choosing to connect to that, it's bad, as we mentioned. We already talked about demons for some time. They're connecting to those forces, and they're pulling strings up there to bring stuff down here. That's not good. We have furthermore explained how the primary essence of every physical thing is that which exists in the transcendental roots. That which exists on the physical plane is merely a reflection of what is originated and composed on this higher level. Awesome. On this level, it was also arranged to permit those elements which are appropriate to the nature of existence and its various aspects to propagate with respect to what should be in the roots as well as in the branches. The highest wisdom then conveys these elements through a sequence that transmits and reflects their essence from one form to another until they are bound and delineated in their physical form. Meaning, things originate up on high, depending on their origin point, and retain the essence of the thing as it makes its way down the system into this physical world. And therefore, if we see, let's see, blessing of crop, bounty. So that has a source in a root of blessing and bounty, of crop, what that means in its deeper essence. Or God forbid if we see winds that are wreaking havoc. So that could go back to a spiritual root of what wind would mean, ruach, and would be deriving power from there. Now we're going to see that this gets very complex. Because let's say in the spiritual roots, God wants there to be something called wind in the world, and there to be something called trees in the world. Well, let's say there's a decree that the force of wind, usually the force of wind does not override the force of tree. Trees are able to, even though it's windy, the tree stays firmly rooted in the ground. But if there's some decree based on some sequence of actions, as we're going to see, that relates to you and I, because through our actions down here, we influence the roots and thereby bring the energy back down to the system here. If through our actions there is some decree that says that the spiritual forces of tree should be uprooted, so usually tree is able to stand when there's wind. But the forces or the angels of wind could then gain energy. The force of tree could lose energy. And then you'll have a situation where wind is uprooting trees down here. So you have to realize these are happening at higher dimensions. In this sefer, we start going into the basics of the Kabbalistic model. This is really a book which is called the Introduction to Kabbalah. There therefore exists over each physical thing a chain of roots, one above the other, reaching up to the original forces. Each of these remain in its proper position, permanently sustaining itself in the level and domain ordained by the Creator. All of the roots influence their branches in the physical world, So it'd be like an upside down tree. You get what I'm saying? That the tree is upside down, the roots go all the way up, and as we come down the world, you have a big trunk, and then you have branches, and then ultimately fruits, which is you and I. And it's all to get to the fruits. All the roots influence their branches in the physical world according to the sequence without ever exceeding their natural limitations. However, it was decreed that these forces should be able to act upon the physical world in another manner, independent of the order of the sequence. Okay, something's about to happen here. They can thus act independently upon the physical in a manner that conforms to their own innate laws, rather than the physical laws of nature. It is through this mode of action that the normal laws of nature can be suspended and altered on the physical plane. God gave man the ability to manipulate creation in this manner, just as he gave him the power to do so in a natural fashion. I don't think he's only talking about like Mr. Burns. Remember when he wanted to stop the sun? You guys never saw any Simpsons episodes?
Yeah, I did.
If only I knew Simpsons. If I Mishnayos, I can remember this stuff. Okay, like he was like a beginner's bad guy. So he had a thing, the sun stopping machine. And it was like this giant thing that like stopped the sun.
Also, like he'd be the only one to power electricity or something.
Exactly.
Everyone would need lights.
Exactly.
Electricity to make more money.
So in the same way that we can do so down here, that man can manipulate nature down here, either for the good or otherwise, we have the power spiritually also to influence up there that things should change. The two are also the same insofar as man cannot use either the natural or the theurgic to do anything that he wishes, but is restricted by particular limitations of both processes. The way in which man manipulates things in a natural manner is thus limited by the laws of nature and the properties of manner. For example, if one wants to cut something, he must use a sharp instrument such as a knife. You can't cut an apple with water, let's say, unless you harness the water in a specific way. But let's say you want to cut a rock and you want to use a piece of jello to do so. You'd have a hard time cutting that rock with just like splatting jello on it. You'd have to work with certain laws of how nature works in order to do what you want to do. And if you want to float in something, you might have to decide to use a buoyant item to float and not a single piece of A4 paper. That wouldn't be a great boat. Yeah, Ariel?
So essentially man can manipulate nature, but only within the laws of nature itself.
So far there is a level that man is limited to certain things, but harnessing nature, using nature, he has power. If he wishes to climb, he must use something like a ladder. It's hard to climb using a swimming pool. These are just obvious ideas. But if to the degree that man can understand the natural order of the world, he can manipulate. He has to be careful to do things for positive, obviously. But yes, man has a control over nature. He can only squeeze something if it's compressible. This is true of all man's manipulation of things in a natural manner. The same is also true of man's manipulation of things in a theurgic, spiritual manner. He can only do so within defined limits and through the specific procedures deemed best by the highest wisdom. Therefore, use the examples you have down here that there are rules. It's hard for me to squeeze a piece of stainless steel. But I could squeeze a lemon. So I realize that there's rules down here. In that same way, I realize in the spiritual worlds, there's also rules. That if I do X, it will make this outcome. And here's where you start learning, and you go to tzaddikim, and they tell you, if you want this outcome, then do this mitzvah. If you want to see this outcome, say this kapitel of Tehillim.
You're not doing the mitzvah for the sake of the mitzvah then.
He's telling you to strengthen yourself in this mitzvah. Because this mitzvah, of course you want to do it for the sake of the mitzvah. That's pashut. But he's adding on something. He's adding on. You should know there's a dimension of what you're doing in this mitzvah that is moving things around.
So different mitzvah have different outcomes, specified outcomes.
Correct, and correspond to different natural outcomes in this world.
How do we find out what they are?
You hang around the right people, and they start giving you some of the secrets. There's a book called Sefer Charedim, which goes through a lot of the connections of what body parts correspond to what mitzvahs, and if you want to create healing effects on your body, anatomy of the soul, based on the teachings of Rabbi Nachman.
It's like a mitzvah guidebook.
A mitzvah guidebook of knowing that things correspond.
What's it called, the name of the book?
One, an English one is Anatomy of the Soul, written by Rav Chaim Kramer, which corresponds to different parts of your body, how they relate to different mitzvahs. And another book, Sefer Charedim, in Hebrew, who was the Rebbe of the Arizal. So you know that's good stuff. He was buried right beside the Arizal in Tzfat. Wrote a very powerful Sefer about what mitzvahs correspond to which things, what body parts. Anger corresponds to the liver. If God forbid a person's having a liver problem, well, obviously do the basics. Stop boozing and drinking so much. But realize there's a deeper story. Anger. Anger is at play here. It's the liver. So you start being able to make the spiritual healing and the spiritual outcomes in the physical world through spiritual means. So really the answer at this point is, of course you use both. In the same way that we have to learn the physical world and operate in the physical world in the right way, so too we operate in the spiritual world to affect the physical world. Like the Lev Rabbi always tells me, if you want Parnasa, then learn Mishnah. Mishnah is the gematria of Parnasa. It's the same numerical value as Parnasa, as making a livelihood. So you think like, really? I thought a livelihood means like work a 9 to 5. Bring home a paycheck. Yeah, that's also part of it. But there's another spiritual system set up entirely called that abundance is connected to something called learning Mishnayos. And that sequence is a very, very complex sequence in the way that there's laws of the natural world that you have to learn. And if you try to squeeze a piece of stainless steel, it's not going to be so good for creating lemon juice. And you learn these things, and you learn the complexities of these things. So too in the spiritual world, you learn the complexities of all the connections, of all the makeup of the spiritual world. And that's where you can go to big tzaddikim, and they could tell you wondrous things that you should be doing to create outcomes here in the physical world based on the spiritual phenomena up there. Arya?
Can a man with great knowledge in the spiritual world force nature to change in a certain way? Like, for example, Moses, when he was supposed to speak to a rock to bring out water, he had instead struck it, which technically was not according to command, yet still water came out.
Correct. So, first of all, it's pretty impressive, nonetheless, even though he was not asked to do it. The answer to that is that there's rules up there. There are rules up there. One example I always come back to is the Baba Sali. So the Baba Sali was famous that he had a bottle of arak. And he would pour arak. Arak is a type of anise liquor made from star anise. And it's a clear substance. And he had a bottle of it. And when people would come, he would make a l'chaim. And he kept the bottle in a paper bag. It was covered. And we have endless testimonies who watched him firsthand, thousands of people, who watched him pour arak all night from a single bottle. People who were there, corroborating firsthand evidence that say he just kept pouring. Now, why did he need to cover the bag?
He's going to show us the secret.
Okay, there are rules even when you get up there. There's rules up there. Okay, he was tapped into how you make a bottle not empty and have unlimited arak come out of it. And there's other such examples of tzaddikim having money pouches, that whenever they would reach into the pouch, money would just come out. So they tapped into certain rules up there that it wasn't, why did it have to be in a pouch? Why couldn't they just look in their hand and then money would start to crystallize in front of them?
How does one find these
These money pouches? So you have to know the right people. But what we're pointing out is, even once you get to the world of understanding the roots of things, in the same way that there's rules down here, there's rules up there. And you have to learn those rules. That's what we're pointing out. It's very important that you get this point. It's not like you get into the world of miracle, you get into the spiritual world, and like anything goes. He says, down here there's rules, there's also rules up there.
Have you accessed any of these rules? Do you have any of these?
Money pouches?
Not necessarily a money pouch, but anything of a similar thing. Like, have you ever done something like this?
These are things that you are doing right now by learning Torah. Even now that you're learning Torah, you're making moves right now. There's moves that you're making. When you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Pamayim B'chol Yom, you are making moves, whether you realize it or not. And therefore the first step is just knowing you're doing it now. To the degree that you know what you're doing, the moves are stronger. If you really know what you're doing, you start to be poyalois.
Because you're doing it with intention?
Yes. But there's a system here. There's a system. Third G also has another function. This means understanding the spiritual makeup. As discussed earlier, it means the spiritual makeup, spiritual system. Now we're going to see this is ultimately going to take us into understanding God's names. That's when it really starts to get cooking. And that on the opposite side, this is going to take us into black magic. Those that use God's names, they go and learn the system to manipulate the system for selfish desire. That's bad. That's why once a person gets up there, if they're not sufficiently pure, and they go looking like, yo, find me some Kabbalist, like, and get me X, Y, and Z. And they're not coming for holy purposes, like, pull the strings up there for me. So that's not good. That's called the process of black magic, called kishuf.
How does Hashem let such a person get to that level of understanding and manipulation?
Because he gives us free will. That's the power of free will. But that's why it gets, the higher up you get, the more responsible you have to be. The higher up you get, the more responsible you have to be. That's why for many years they said, be careful of Kabbalah. Especially practical Kabbalah, which is really dealing with affecting very concrete shifts and changes in this world based on moving stuff around. So if a person's like, this is cool, and he doesn't use this power properly, then that's just evil. That's bad. And we see that. I think was it a great Rabbi that once said, with great power comes great responsibility? Rabbi Spiderman. So,
are there any accounts of
he's really quoting.
Are there any accounts of someone gaining that level and then starting to use black magic and then turning around and using that black magic for a good cause? Like going into it with bad intentions and then turning it into something good? Or does it just cease being black magic at that point?
Pretty sure that's the plot of like every Marvel movie ever made.
It's dangerous. It's dangerous. So you person you can't even go into black magic. Period. End. It's usher. It's completely forbidden. If a person did and they have lost themselves in it, we do believe they can do tshuva, that they can come back from it. But it's a real journey for that person to come back. Because if a person went into the dark side, he wasn't allowed to go in. He failed in his free will decision making. And he has to, even if he saw things and he experienced things, he has to do tshuva. But of course he can fix his life. We believe anybody, you could turn your life around. So no matter how far a person fell, how much he feels like he's in a dark place, and that he was surrounding himself with dark forces, you can get up. You can begin again anew, today. Yeah, or?
Rabbi, is it true that sometimes when people are doing magic that they shouldn't be doing that Yetzer Hara or like the evil forces try to get them, and sometimes.
They love that. They sneak in right at that time.
But like, let's say like a very holy person, suddenly all these terrible things start happening in his house burns. That people can tell in the community that you could have been doing magic.
Yes, there is such a thing. Is that the higher you get and the more advanced you get, it says that kol echad shegodol mechaveroi, anybody who's greater than his fellow, yitzro godol himena, his yetzer hara is also bigger. His yetzer hara, it's not bigger that it's like coarse. At a certain point, you think the Rosh Yeshiva has a struggle to put on tefillin? I don't know, should I put on tefillin or not? Oy, 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 you know? He's not struggling with that. Whereas somebody new to yeshiva could be like, I don't know, you know? Like, I was going to go out with the boys. But bro, like tefillin, sunset, I don't know. That's free will.
Sounds like mine.
Okay, fine. You still got some hours.
You know,
Barely.
I'm always like, I always do it to the very last minute.
Okay, fine. So that's a free will. That's real free will. But for the Rosh Yeshiva, it's higher levels of the Kabbalistic combinations and how much he's thinking and what level of thought while his tefillin is on his head. Very high level stuff. And the higher up you go, the more sophisticated the Yetzer Hara becomes. So the higher a person gets, the sophistication of dark magic becomes more alluring. And he has to be very careful of that. And yes, we do have an example of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, people that were a Kohen Gadol for the better part of a century. And then they go off, they become a tzeduki, they fall off. There's such a thing of big people falling. That's why the Gemara says, Al tamin ba'atzmecha ad yom misascha. Don't think I'm in the clear. Not till the final breath you take. We should live until 120 years, B'ezrat Hashem, but to know that you have to be on guard, my friends. You got to be, I would never look at the shmutz. I'm an established person. And next thing he knows, what is happening to me? How could this be happening? Al tamin be'atzmecha. Don't think I'm in the clear until the final breath. We should live until 120 years, 180 years. We should binyan beis hamikdash now, mamish, and the shitzit kingdom of Amen. Amen. Have a wonderful day, my friend.